Good evening and welcome to Altos, your weekly Catholic news program here on Trinity TV and TTT. I'm Roger Sands, sitting in for Neil Parsonlal. Our top stories this week. Attendees at Wednesday's Archdiocesan Leadership Conference have been challenged to not only become holy, but more whole. Cloistered Dominican sister Mary Ann Bradshaw has been laid to rest. Her death likely means the closure of the Rosary Monastery, a landmark in St. Anne's. The Caribbean Church says a final farewell to Cardinal Kelvin Felix. We go to Dominica for the burial, and later we speak with a familiar guest, economist Dr. Marlene Atz, on the implications of the recent mid-year budget review. Our top story this week: what we don't transform, we will transmit. Catholic leaders heard this from Director of Pastoral Formation, Father Matthew Ragbear, at the Leadership Conference held at the Center of Excellence in Macoya on Labor Day. Laura Pickford-Gordon attended and prepared this report.
Susan, can we talk outside for a minute, please?
And is it true that you and that girl married? Not all that, Nelson.
The theme was leadership and formation in a synodal church. Short skits were used to present realities and for participants to reflect on their experiences of parish and their actions. The second session was a panel discussion on leaders being and becoming whole and holy.
We come to God and we come to church with all that is within us. We are not a different person when we come to church, or when we're at work, or when we're with our friends, when we are with family. We are the same person. And we carry those wounds that are deeply intertwined into who we are, and it manifests in how we react, how we respond to people, and how we lead in ministry, how we show up or how we do not show up.
Using his own life as an example, Father Ragbear said God has used his brokenness and that transformation is a journey of confronting, navigating conflict, obtaining feedback, and allowing oneself to grow.
Are we mindful of ourselves and what God wants to do? It's easy to get busy in ministry, and it's easy to hide behind ministry, sisters and brothers. To get burnout, to be busy, and to think, I don't need any help anymore. We're all on a journey, and here we are, being and becoming.
It's understanding that God finds you when you're hiding in your brokenness, in your feeling of unworthiness, in that space of ego that you're telling yourself all kinds of things to make yourself feel better. He finds you, and he loves you, and he gives you grace.
The Leadership Conference was about preparing leaders for a synodal church. Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon asked participants to be fully engaged, to move from protecting themselves to being more vulnerable and trusting of each other. I am Laura Pickford-Gordon for Catholic News, Altos.
That is priest is how Father Trevor Nathasingh was described on Tuesday as he celebrated his 35th anniversary of ordination to the priesthood. A Thanksgiving Mass was celebrated at Father Trevor's parish, St. Paul's in Couva, and we have more. An overflowing church was moving to the sound of the Point Fortin music ministry, a former parish of Father Trevor. With a Holy Spirit theme, the faithful came from all over the country, including many of Father's former parishes of OLPH, Mayaro, Grandy, and Laventille, to celebrate. In his welcome, Father Trevor said God calls all, even the unworthy.
And I'm one of those unworthy men that God has chosen to call and bless with his goodness and with his mercy for these 35 years of ministry as a pastor.
Parish priest of St. Philip and St. James in Chaguanas, Father Steve Ransom, delivered the homily, and he had the congregation in agreement, describing Father Trevor's legacy. In giving thanks to the faithful for their support over the years, Father Trevor recalled his conversion experience and made a call for more to join the priesthood.
And I still want to encourage all of the young men and young women, don't let the secular world draw you. Think about a life of service to Jesus Christ and His church. You know my story. I come from a non-Christian background. And God got hold of me. And as I said last night, I distinctly heard God say that with a voice saying to me in front of St. Charles Harrison Church in Tunapuna, you shall be my peace. And turn me around, he could do it to anyone.
After the Mass celebration and a sharing was held where further tributes were paid to Father Trevor. We certainly congratulate him. While the family and friends of the Dominican Order and the community of the Rosary Monastery bade farewell to custodian and the last of the cloistered contemplative nuns at Rosary Monastery, Sister Mary Ann Bradshaw. Sister Ann, as she was fondly known, died at the age of 82 on the 5th of June. She was laid to rest on June 14th, following a funeral mass at the monastery's chapel. In his homily, Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon described the day as a monumental one, as those gathered were there not only to say goodbye to Sister Ann, but also sadly to bid farewell to the monastery, which has been a staple of the Archdiocese. The Archbishop added that Sister Ann, with her infectious smile and big heart, really endeared so many people to her and to the monastery. You can read more of what the Archbishop said on the future of the monastery in Sunday's issue of the Catholic News. And a chapter in the history of the Caribbean Catholic Church has been closed with the final interment of Cardinal Kelvin Felix. Editor Raymond Sims covered the funeral mass in Castries at St. Lucia on the 12th of June and followed up with the final rites in Dominica.
Cardinal Kelvin Felix will never be forgotten by Dominica's Catholic community, as his final resting place is at the very entrance to the cathedral. His body was brought to his homeland from St. Lucia by ferry on Saturday, June 15th, and carried in procession through the streets of Roseau to the cathedral chapel. The first cardinal from the English-speaking Caribbean was buried following a memorial mass on Wednesday, June 19th. Chief celebrant Archbishop Gabriel Malzé of Castries, the apostolic administrator for Roseau, preached a homily which had as its theme a life for God's people.
We are gathered here to bid farewell to a beloved son of the Dominican soil, who has done just that. He has laid down his life for his Caribbean people. And he did so with such distinction that the Holy Father Francis saw it fit to elevate him with the honor of the cardinalate. We cannot but appreciate the sacrifice that this man of God has been for the sake of God's people in the Diocese of Roseau and in the Caribbean and in the world.
Archbishop Malzé told the congregation, which included Dominica's Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit, that Cardinal Felix will be remembered as a man of prayer and being a generous priest. He will be remembered most of all as a man of unity and as a humble servant of God.
If by his life example he can inspire one man to the priesthood, to the diaconate, to the brotherhood, or one young woman to the religious life, or one young couple to faithful conjugal union, his long and hard work would not be in vain. If he can inspire us all to a life of deeper prayer, to generosity with the gifts he has received, to concern, especially a concern for the children and the less fortunate, and to lead others to Jesus, his long and hard work would not be in vain. As his remains laid to rest in the cathedral yard, in the view of the faithful, let it be a continual source of inspiration to God's people here in the Diocese of Roseau and beyond. He awakens with you in glory, for you are the resurrection and the life.
This is my story.
I am Raymond Sims for Catholic News Altos.
Away from the Caribbean now, Pope Francis became the first pope to address a G7 summit and held 10 bilateral meetings with the leaders of the US, Ukraine, India, Kenya, France, Turkey, Canada, and Brazil. We have more from Rome Reports.
According to a White House statement, the two discussed the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. President Biden also thanked the Pope for his efforts in returning abducted Ukrainian children to their families. Most of Pope Francis' other meetings also centered around international conflict. The president of Kenya called for peace in the Congo and South Sudan and expressed his gratitude for an initiative of the community of Sant'Egidio. The Pope also met with the president of Brazil, who revealed that the two discussed the fight against hunger and inequality in the world. Other leaders at the G7 released the content of their meetings through social media. The Prime Minister of India says he invited Pope Francis to visit India, while the President of Turkey only posted group photos with other politicians. The Canadian Prime Minister also notably said that he made a request to the Pope that he return the cultural artifacts in the Vatican to the Indigenous peoples of Canada.
And back at home in parish news, St. Dominic's in Pinal has launched a football initiative to help combat the scourge of crime. The motivation behind the Football League is the potential in sports to play a powerful, transformative and pivotal role in the fight against crime. The initiative gives the youths the space and opportunity to live meaningful and productive lives and possibly reduce the risk of these impressionable minds being influenced to go the route of deviant behavior. This sports ministry for young men in the Venezuelan and Trinbagonian communities in the area has attracted foreign partnership, and the Union Triniven FC Academy will be launched with the collaboration of church, sport professionals, coaches, and other youth ministries and schools in the area. The launch of the academy is carded for the 29th of June, and we will be sure to monitor this ongoing story. We'll take a short break and return to chat with Marlene Atz, economist, about national economic affairs. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Well, we're talking about the economy, and just over a week ago, Finance Minister Colm Imbert delivered his mid-year budget review. Joining us on set is a familiar face to you here on Altos, economist Marlene Atz. And good day. Thank you very much for joining us. And I guess the highlight coming out of that, one of the highlights would be a $3 billion shortfall in terms of revenue halfway through the financial year. And it was attributed to really lower natural gas prices. Give us a little more explanation, a little more in-depth on that situation. And is it something that is recoverable? Is it something that the country of Trinidad and Tobago has any measure of control over?
Right. Good question, and thanks again for having me on set, Roger. Always a pleasure to be here. I think the deficit, and I welcome the opportunity to put some clarity, not the technical clarity around the energy sector, but what happens in terms of when government makes its revenue estimates for the fiscal year, They look at the oil sector, the gas sector, data coming from international sources on what the projected prices would be in both oil and gas, a basket of gas products, etc. And we use a weighted average, as it's called, in terms of our gas price. And we similarly look at what the benchmarks are for Brent crude, etc., in terms of the oil prices. And the government uses all of that information, the technocrats in the Ministry of Finance. They will pull all that information together with energy sector experts and come up with the best laid plans in terms of where they think prices will fall and how it will feed into government's revenue from the oil sector. And we all know that the best laid plans can go awry. So sometimes you might find geopolitics. So when the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022, we didn't anticipate that, but it was a good thing for us because it sent prices up because Russia is a significant player in the energy sector. And when they essentially held back as part of their geopolitical strategy, it benefited. So there was a shortage of demand. So it's demand and supply and some other things inside of there. But I think the most important point for us in Trinidad and Tobago is to, again, appreciate that we don't control those prices. So even though we budget for 85 a barrel and 5 based on all of the data, and these are conservative prices, we come up with the best laid plan. So the United States has capitalized on the global geopolitics, and they've now flooded the market with oil and gas, which of course means that it's putting downward pressure on the prices. So prices are not as buoyant. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we also have the challenge that there is lower production. So even if we're putting out there in terms of volume, the volume is significantly lower. But the other thing that I want to add in terms of government's revenue projections, and again, a significant point for us, government projects revenue from the oil sector and from the non-oil sector. So the 54 that goes down to 51 is in part because of a hit in the oil part, but also there is also the non-oil revenue, so things from taxation. And you would have heard Minister Imbert speak just prior to the mid-year review or so shortly thereafter, but certainly in those intervening days, speaking about the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority and the need for the government to improve their systems of tax collection. So there is the non-oil revenue that also needs to be looked at. So in that basket would have been conversations around property tax. Remember, for the last couple of years, property tax raised its head at every budget presentation, and then there is silence.
Well, and we seem to be in a period of silence right now.
Precisely with the property tax. But then there is also conversation around the inland revenue not collecting taxes. And within the last couple of weeks, we'd have seen a public display of naming and shaming some persons who are business owners owing significant amounts of tax revenue. So it's really that 54 down to 51 really is both on the oil side in terms of oil revenue, but also in the non-oil sector. So it does present a bit of a challenge.
And where does that lead us as we are on the verge of the national budget, which usually comes around September, October? This deficit in terms of revenue, our revenue position.
All right, so the deficit has moved from 5 billion, just over 5 billion, to now 9 billion. It is significant. Government's expenditure has also gone up to over $61 billion. It is one of the largest. So when we had the mid-year review, the supplementary appropriation bill that was passed on the 7th, that was presented on the 7th and passed within the days following that, it took our budget up to one of the largest budgets that we've ever seen in the country of $61 billion, and a deficit that is pretty healthy at $9 billion. It means, just to remind our viewers, that government is spending $9 billion more than it is actually earning in terms of revenue. And oftentimes we feel, and I know on some occasions Minister Imbert has himself said, when people kind of give him, Trini talk, throw talk for him and say, hey, that was a sweetener budget, that was an election budget. And I remember on one occasion he said, and I think it was in 2020, he said if it was an election budget, it would have been close to $60 billion. So when he presented his supplementary appropriation on the 7th, I was kind of like, okay, so if this is $61 billion now, how much are we going to see in September? And the challenge really is going to be for us as a country, how do we meet that shortfall? So again, so a lot has been happening in the economy. I always say it's a good time to be an economist. A lot has been happening. So within the last week, Minister Imbert went on the international market and raised a bond.
Oversubscribed, apparently.
Oversubscribed, but I think somewhere in the subtext, the point was lost that now adds to government's debt.
Right.
All right, because when you raise a bond, when you float a bond, whether it is oversubscribed or not, that then contributes to the government's debt. And it was raised in US, so that means it is government debt in foreign exchange. And we know the conversation around foreign exchange and the shortage, and the foreign exchange conversation, the shortages that we face are in fact linked to declines in production and declines in revenue from the energy sector, because the energy sector is where we earn the bulk of the foreign exchange in Trinidad and Tobago. About 80% of our forex comes from that source. So if revenue is declining from that source, it stands to reason that our forex stream is going to be trickling. And it means that if you want to access forex, you're going to have to draw down on the reserves. So it really is a kind of convoluted time for us you know.
And when you say the reserves, are you talking about the HSF, the Heritage and Stabilization Fund?
So we have, the HSF is what we call our, well, in layman's term, I'll call it our national savings account, in a sense. It's the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, meant to provide for, as the name implies, future generations, because we earn our wealth in Trinidad and Tobago from non-renewable resources. So when you extract oil, gas, it doesn't go back, it doesn't renew itself, it doesn't regenerate itself. So you want to put aside something in the kitty for future generations who may not yet be born, but you want them to be able to experience the wealth that Trinidad and Tobago had from the oil and gas sector. The HSF also is for stabilization, and the most poignant time that we used it was for COVID-19. So in March 2020, COVID-19 was declared a catastrophe for us, and we were able to dip into that savings fund, as it were. So that is one of our buffers, but the other buffer that we have is where you hear conversations about the reserves in terms of months of import cover.
Right.
That is really our source of reserves. But the trick about where we are is that when our exchange rate is tottering because of extreme demand for foreign exchange, the central bank has a very important role. They can intervene in the market, technical language, meaning they can use some of our reserves, not the HSF, use some of our reserves, that import cover, and put some of the forex into the market to maintain stability in the exchange rate. So when we're demanding goods and services, we're buying new cars, we're going into supermarkets, we're spending foreign exchange essentially, because many of the goods and services that we're consuming are not made in Trinidad and Tobago, so they have to be paid for in forex. When we're doing all of those things, we're actually also drawing down on our reserves. And the central bank issued their annual report for 2023, where they actually spoke to the fact that they've had to kind of dip into the reserves to provide some stability to the forex market, and also to use some of the money to put into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So while it is not, we're not sounding the alarm just yet, we are in some kind of precarious times, and last week my contribution to the Catholic News spoke about the balancing the narrative, and I think really one of the reasons that I always welcome the opportunity to come here to Altos is really to provide an opportunity for people to hear that we need to be doing some balancing. So the way we consume as individuals, you might think, well, you know, I just go and I just buy
the basics.
Basics and buy my strawberries and that kind of thing. That is foreign exchange that you're consuming,
yes.
Literally and figuratively. Yeah, so.
Right. Now, the minister also sounded a note of optimism, saying that revenue projections will improve by 2026, 2027. And I think he's linking that to the fact that more gas will come on the market. But then, again, we're dependent on energy.
Yes, and two things I want to make on that. Yes, we're dependent on energy, but additional gas coming on stream, there's a lot of dependence on Venezuela in terms of the Dragon gas. Venezuela has elections in July of this year. The US has elections this year. And those are two significant events, right, the outcome of which could significantly impact the Dragon gas deal. Either, you know, there are conversations about President Trump returning to the White House. We know that he has a very hard position in terms of geopolitical relations with Venezuela, for example. And that's a serious conversation, apparently, about President Trump returning. But we also don't know what will happen, you know, what is going to be the tenor if President Biden returns and the Democrats win. We don't know what happens if there's a change in leadership in Venezuela. We're not too sure. So even though there is a light somewhere at the end of the tunnel, There are forces that could mitigate how brightly that light can shine in terms of moving forward. So that's the first thing I want to say in terms of the energy, in terms of the revenues. But the second point is that, again, these vacillations geopolitically that impact on our revenue stream, they are reminders for us that we need to do the transition. So we need to kind of start to put some of our eggs in other baskets, so to speak, and not depend totally on the energy sector.
And that will be the subject of another discussion. How do we move away from the dependence on oil and gas for our economy? Well, thank you very much, economist Dr. Marlene Atz, for chatting with us here on Altos and giving us your insightful perspective. We'll take a short break and return with more right after this.
We are taking a leap of faith on Trinity TV. Jump in with us for this new and exciting experience.
Congratulations to our clergy celebrating anniversaries. And now let's take a look at some of the upcoming events in the Archdiocese. And to tell us about some of the stories in this week's episode of the Catholic News, we have editor Raymond Sims.
In this week's issue, 3 Corpus Christi Carmelites celebrate their Jubilee anniversary. And in international news, President of the Italian Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Zuppi, visits a pediatric hospital in Bethlehem and sees the suffering of children deprived of adequate medical care. I am Raymond Sims, editor of the Catholic News.
Yes, make sure and pick up your copy. Well, that brings us to the end of Altos for this week. A reminder, you can send correspondence to altos@catholictt.org. And to wrap up our program, we return to the Leadership Conference on Wednesday with a bit more of what we call the conference spirit.